If you grew up in America from the late 1980s to the early 2000s, there was a place your parents took you to that was bigger than anything else in your world. It wasn't an amusement park. It wasn't a movie theater. It was in a familiar strip mall, between a laundromat and a shoe store, with a colorful sign and a backward R as if a kid had drawn it himself. It said Toys R Us, and you went there on weekends. You went because your parents needed to buy something, and you went along because you had no choice. Then around the second or third time, you realized you didn't want a choice. You wanted to be there. You wanted to walk through those doors and disappear into the world inside. The automatic doors slid open, and a rush of cool air poured out, carrying the bright white light from rows of fluorescent fixtures down aisles that seemed to stretch forever. And that's when everything changed. You were no longer standing next to your parents. You were shorter than them. You saw the world from the eye level of a kid not even a meter tall. And from that perspective, everything became gigantic. Shelves towered like walls, toy boxes nearly as big as your whole body. Aisles stretched like roads you could walk down endlessly. Up front was fine. Simple stuff. A few easy to see, easy to grab items. But that wasn't why you came. The reason you came was the aisles in the back. That was the real place. The Lego section, where yellow boxes stacked up like bricks from another world. The Barbie section, where everything was shiny, perfect, and pink. The action figures section, where superheroes stood in rows, waiting to be chosen, waiting to be taken home to start a new story. And then the video game area, where a Nintendo or PlayStation glowed in the corner of the store with a few kids waiting their turn, controllers in hand, eyes glued to the screen. And above you, bicycles hung suspended as if they were flying, as if gravity didn't apply here. Everything was bigger, brighter, more, and the sound never stopped. The clatter of shopping cart wheels, kids calling to each other, toy boxes clunking together as someone took one down and put it back, all of it blending into a sound you didn't notice at the time but later you would remember so clearly. And the smell. There was always a smell. New plastic, cardboard, something hard to name, but if you'd ever been there, you'd recognize it instantly. And then you ran, not because you planned to run, you just ran. You walked faster than your parents, then faster still. Then you vanished from their sight, pulled into some aisle you'd never seen before. Maybe Lego, maybe remote control cars, maybe something you didn't know you needed until you saw it. And you stood there, in front of hundreds of choices. Too many choices. You picked one up, put it down, picked up another. You didn't know which to choose. And for the first time in your life, that wasn't a problem. That was the experience. And then your parents' voices found you. You can pick one. And instantly everything got serious. You weighed options. You compared. You tried to stretch the moment as long as possible. Because you knew, even if you didn't say it, that once you chose, you have to leave. And through all of it, there was one thing always present. On the signs. On the carts. In the ads, Jeffrey the giraffe. You never thought about it much, but you always recognized it. It was always there, like a part of the place. And if you had to explain what that place was, you might say it was a toy store. But that wouldn't be right. Not completely. Because it wasn't just a store. It was the place where being a kid actually meant something. Where imagination didn't just exist. It was lined up in rows for you to choose from. And for a very long time, it always felt like it would be there forever, like a fixed part of the world, like a place you could return to any time, until one day, somehow, you stopped going back. And you didn't realize that the last time you walked in there was the last time. Before it became the toy empire tied to the childhood of millions of American families, in 1948 in Washington, D.C., it was just a small store called Children's Bargain Town, selling basic children's items like cribs, strollers, and furniture. And the man behind it was Charles P. Lazarus, born in 1923, a World War II veteran who had just returned and started a business in an America entering the post-1945 baby boom, when birth rates surged and millions of young families needed to buy products for raising kids. And at first the model worked steadily, but nothing special. until Lazarus realized something that would later become the foundation for the entire growth of Toys R Us. The items he was selling, like cribs or strollers, were one-time purchases that didn't generate repeat revenue, while toys were completely different because kids grew up fast, tastes changed constantly, and parents had to come back again and again to buy more. And that insight led him to start shifting direction in the late 1950s, gradually replacing traditional products with toys until 1957, when the first Toys R Us store officially opened in Rockville, Maryland, marking the birth of an entirely new retail model. And the name Toys R Us with the backward R wasn't just a fun detail, it was a branding strategy, creating the feeling that a child had written it and emphasizing that this place was designed for kids, not adults. And from there, Lazarus began building a big box retail model. Huge stores with thousands of square meters holding tens of thousands of different products, where customers could find almost any toy in a single visit. And throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Toys R Us expanded rapidly, taking advantage of the growth of American suburbs, where more and more middle-class families lived, and each new store was placed in convenient, car-accessible locations that fit the American lifestyle of the era. And this model helped Toys R Us become one of the first retailers to use what would later be called the category killer strategy, focusing entirely on one product category and doing it better than any competitor in selection, price, and experience. And by the late 1970s, Toys R Us had become the largest toy retail chain in America, surpassing traditional department stores that only treated toys as a side category. And growth continued in the following years as the company opened hundreds of stores nationwide and gradually expanded internationally. But even during that strong growth phase, the first signs of risk began to appear, though no one really paid attention, because the entire business model relied almost completely on large physical stores with huge square footage and massive inventory, which required high operating costs and stable customer shopping behavior. And for a long time, that wasn't a problem because consumers were still used to going to stores to shop. But this model also meant the company was vulnerable to any change in technology or consumer behavior. And at the time, no one really thought that would happen because Toys R Us was thriving, dominating the market and becoming the first name every family thought of when they needed toys. And from the outside, it looked unbeatable. But that very dependence on a single model, a single way of operating, was exactly what would make it struggle in the future. And then from the early 1970s through the late 1990s, everything began to accelerate in a way that even insiders could hardly fully imagine. Toys R Us was no longer just an expanding chain. It became a nationwide, then global growth machine at a pace rarely seen in retail at the time. In less than 2 decades, the number of stores grew from a few dozen to hundreds, then thousands. By the late 1980s, the company had hundreds of locations across the United States, mostly concentrated in suburban areas where middle-class families lived, and during peak years, it could open dozens of new stores each year, capitalizing on the post-war population boom and rising household incomes. Along with that expansion, Toys R Us gradually became a familiar part of everyday life, a destination you didn't even have to think about when you needed toys. It was just there, like a supermarket or a shopping mall. And more importantly, it wasn't just present on ordinary days. It was tied to the most important moments of the year, especially the Christmas season, when industry estimates said 30 to 40% of annual toy sales were generated in the fourth quarter. During that period, Toys R Us became the center of all child-related shopping activity, aisles packed with people, carts overflowing with toys, families lined up waiting to check out. And this didn't happen by accident. It was the result of a carefully built marketing strategy, most notably the 1982 advertising campaign featuring the jingle, "I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid," a simple message that struck exactly the right chord with both children and adults. Over time, that jingle became part of American pop culture, appearing on television, radio, and in multi-year advertising campaigns. Alongside it was the presence of Geoffrey the Giraffe, the brand's official mascot since the 1960s. But in the 1980s and 1990s, it truly became an instantly recognizable icon appearing on store signs, TV commercials, shopping carts, and even on souvenir merchandise, to the point where a child could recognize Jeffrey before they could even read the words Toys R Us. And through all of this, there was an important shift in consumer behavior that Toys R Us not only capitalized on, but helped shape. Children became direct influencers in purchasing decisions, not financially, but in terms of choice. They were the ones pulling parents into the store, guiding them through each aisle, pointing to the item they wanted, and in many cases, they were the ones deciding what would be bought. This made Toys R Us fundamentally different from traditional retailers because the entire experience was designed around children, not adults, from product placement at low eye level to thematic zoning of sections, all intended to keep kids engaged and in the store as long as possible. The result was a model that didn't just succeed, it dominated. By the late 1990s, Toys R Us operated more than 1,500 stores worldwide, with a presence in over 30 countries, including Canada, the UK, France, Germany, Japan, and many other Asian markets. And remarkably, even as it expanded internationally, the core experience remained consistent. A child walking into a Toys R Us in New York or in Tokyo still felt the same overwhelming sense of discovery. That consistency made the brand even stronger because it wasn't just selling products, it was selling a repeatable experience anywhere. Over time, going to Toys R Us stopped being just a shopping trip and became a family activity, a ritual, a part of childhood that parents and children shared together, where kids could dream and adults could witness that joy. And when you look back at this period, what stands out isn't just the growth rate or the number of stores, but the way Toys R Us transcended the role of an ordinary retailer. Because it didn't just sell toys, it became part of American culture, part of collective memory, a place where millions of people once walked in and carried that feeling with them for the rest of their lives. And then came the 1990s, especially the period from around 1990 to 1999, when Toys R Us reached its peak. If you looked at it at that moment, it was very hard to imagine that it could ever weaken, let alone disappear. Because at this point, the company wasn't just a successful retail chain, it was the world's largest toy retailer, holding a significant share of the U.S. toy market and expanding to more than 30 countries, with a total of more than 1,500 stores globally by the end of the 1990s. Each store typically ranged from about 3,000 to over 5,000 square meters, stocked with tens of thousands of different SKUs. From small toys costing a few dollars to large, complex products. And when you walked into a Toys R Us store at that time, you were just entering a retail space, you were entering an ecosystem of choice, where the sheer volume of products was almost impossible to take in during a single visit. That experience was often described with a very accurate phrase, overwhelming choice, a state where customers, especially children, felt both extreme excitement and confusion about where to even start. And for a child, that wasn't a problem to solve it. Was exactly why the place was so appealing. Because for the first time in your life, you weren't limited by scarcity. You were surrounded by endless possibilities. In that moment, many kids genuinely believed this was the greatest place on earth, a place where everything you could imagine existed as a toy sitting on a shelf. And this was reinforced by the presence of iconic products of the era, Mattel's Barbie dolls, Lego sets from Denmark, or gaming systems like the Sony PlayStation launched in 1995 and the Nintendo 64 and 1996 products that weren't just toys but part of a rapidly changing entertainment culture. And all of them were available in the same place, under the same roof, making Toys R Us an irreplaceable destination. At the same time, the company's branding strategy reached full maturity, especially with the phrase, Toys R Us Kid, stemming from the famous 1982 advertising campaign with the jingle, I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid. A simple but powerful message that went beyond advertising and became part of American pop culture. A way to describe an entire generation that grew up with those trips to the store. In that context, going to Toys R Us was no longer just shopping. It became a family ritual, especially during holidays like Christmas, when retail reports showed that roughly 30 to 40% of annual toy sales came in the fourth quarter. In the weeks leading up to the holiday, Toys R Us stores became so crowded it was hard to move carts lined up in long lines. Shelves constantly restocked only to empty again. And the kids who came with their parents weren't just there to buy one toy. They were there to experience the feeling of choosing, the anticipation, the feeling that many people later remembered as an essential part of childhood. And if you stood in one of those stores around 1997 or 1998, looking at the scale, the crowds, the way this brand was woven into American culture, it was easy to believe the model was permanent, that a place like this would always exist. Because it wasn't just a business, it was part of the consumer ecosystem. But right in the midst of that peak period, a quiet change had already begun to take place outside the stores. Not in the layout, not in the displays, but in the way people started thinking about shopping. Because in 1994, Jeff Bezos founded Amazon as an online bookstore, and by 1997, the company had gone public on NASDAQ, marking the beginning of an entirely new model, e-commerce. At the time, it was still very small and almost unnoticeable compared to giant physical retail chains like Toys R Us, but it was there, growing slowly but steadily. And like many other major shifts in business history, it wasn't loud, it wasn't immediate, but it was enough to raise a question that very few people at the time were seriously thinking about. What would happen if one day you no longer had to walk into a store to buy toys? And then the change began, but not in a way that people could notice right away. There wasn't a single moment when everything collapsed, no specific day when Toys R Us suddenly stopped functioning effectively. Instead, it happened slowly, almost silently throughout the early 2000s. If you walked into a store around 2001 or 2002, you still saw the familiar aisles, still saw Lego, Barbie, the newest gaming systems. But something wasn't quite the same anymore. The stores started looking older, less upgraded, the lighting became colder and harsher, the displays grew messier, and the experience that once made the place special gradually lost its magic. And while those surface-level changes were happening, bigger problems were forming behind the scenes, especially in 2005. When Toys R Us was acquired in a leveraged buyout worth about $6.6 billion by three major financial firms, Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado Realty Trust. In theory, the deal was meant to help the company restructure and operate more efficiently. But in reality, it placed an enormous financial burden on the company, with more than $5 billion in debt. From that point on, every decision the company made was dominated by the obligation to service that debt, because each year Toys R Us had to spend hundreds of millions of dollars just on interest payments, estimated at $400 million to $500 million, depending on the year. This completely changed the company's ability to invest. Instead of using money to renovate stores, improve the customer experience, or develop technology platforms, they had to prioritize debt repayment. And in a retail industry that was changing rapidly, the inability to invest became a serious problem, especially as competitors started accelerating. Walmart, with the world's largest scale, could leverage its supply chain to sell toys at lower prices. Target, with its modern design strategy and improved shopping experience in the 2000s, attracted young families. And Amazon, founded in 1994 by Jeff Bezos and by the mid-2000s aggressively expanding into many product categories, offered a completely different model where customers could buy toys from home and receive them in just a few days. At first, Toys R Us didn't completely ignore the internet. They actually signed an exclusive agreement with Amazon in 2000 to run the toy category on the platform. But that deal quickly ran into trouble when Amazon allowed other retailers to sell toys on the same platform, leading to a prolonged lawsuit that ended in 2004 when the relationship between the two officially terminated. From then on, Toys R Us was forced to build its own e-commerce platform from scratch, but by that time they were already years behind Amazon. And while the company tried to catch up, consumer behavior was also shifting, especially after 2008, when smartphones became widespread. Parents grew increasingly accustomed to searching for and buying things online, prioritizing convenience over going to a physical store. This gradually reduced foot traffic to brick-and-mortar locations, creating a negative cycle. Fewer customers led to a worse experience, and a worse experience meant even fewer customers came back. Over time, what had once defined Toys R Us began to disappear. The aisles were still there, the products were still stocked, but the feeling was gone. The magic that once made kids run into the store with excitement slowly faded, and more importantly, the company seemed to no longer understand what it was. It was no longer the cheapest place to compete with Walmart, no longer the best experience to compete with Target, and certainly not the most convenient to compete with Amazon. When a brand loses its clear position in the customer's mind, it begins to lose its competitive edge. And by around 2010 to 2016, the signs of decline became much clearer. Revenue no longer grew as it once did, debt remained high, and the company began closing hundreds of stores to cut costs. But those measures only addressed the symptoms, not the root cause, because the core issue was no longer about costs or scale, it was about identity. And at that point, Toys R Us wasn't just losing customers, it was losing the very thing that had once made it the place millions of children believed was the greatest on earth. And then came a point where everything that had been quietly building up for more than a decade could no longer be delayed. On September 18, 2017, Toys R Us officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the United States, a move aimed at restructuring its debt and finding a way to continue operating. But even at that moment, many people still believed the company could recover because the brand was too big, too familiar, and too deeply tied to American culture to simply disappear completely. But what happened next showed a different reality. By March 2018, the company announced it would liquidate most of its U.S. operations, leading to the closure of more than 700 stores nationwide in 2018. What had once been colorful, noisy spaces turned into empty stores covered with "Everything Must Go" signs. The aisles that used to be packed with toys were now left with empty shelves or the last remaining items deeply discounted, sometimes 50, 60, or even 70% off. For many people, walking into a Toys R Us store at that time was no longer a shopping experience. It was a moment of closure, a final chance to look back at a piece of childhood before it vanished. And the impact of this collapse didn't stop with customers. It directly affected about 30,000 employees in the U.S., who lost their jobs in a short period as the stores closed one by one. In those final days, plenty of people returned not to buy toys, but to walk through the familiar aisles one more time, to stand in the places where they had once stood as children, to remember the feeling that used to exist there. After the liquidation process ended, Toys R Us effectively disappeared from the American market, leaving a void that no other brand has truly been able to fill. But the story didn't completely end there. In 2021, the Toys R Us brand was acquired by WHP Global, a brand management company, with the goal of reviving the name in a new form. By 2022, Toys R Us returned to the U.S. market through a partnership with Macy's, opening toy departments inside Macy's stores nationwide, as well as rebuilding an e-commerce platform. But even though the brand still exists, even though the name is still there, the experience has changed completely. There are no longer the massive standalone stores with tens of thousands of products, no longer the endless aisles that kids could run through, no longer the overwhelming feeling that once defined an entire generation. What remains feels like a scaled-down version, an effort to preserve the memory in a world that has moved on. And if you look at everything that happened, from the peak to the collapse and then to the revival, the clearest thing isn't that a company failed, but that an experience disappeared. Because Toys R Us was never just a toy store. It was the place where millions of children first felt the power of choice, the spark of imagination, and the pure joy of being a kid. And when that's gone, even if the name comes back, the feeling is never quite the same. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next interesting stories. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.